There is footage that exists from August 20th, 1983 that has been watched, rewatched, and analyzed by music historians for over 4 decades. It is grainy. The audio is imperfect. The angles are awkward, the way amateur and semi-professional concert recordings from that era often are, a single camera trying to capture something that nobody fully anticipated would matter this much. But the footage is real. It happened, and it captured one of the most significant, unscripted moments in the history of two artists whose relationship would shape the trajectory of popular music for the rest of the 20th century. This is the story of that night. The man who taught him how to move. By the summer of 1983, Michael Jackson was, by any measurable standard, the most successful recording artist in the world. Thriller had been released in November of the previous year. It was already reshaping the commercial possibilities of what an album could achieve, climbing towards sales figures that no industry executive had previously believed were attainable. Michael was 24 years old. He had spent 18 of those years performing, first beside his brothers, then increasingly as a singular, transformative solo presence whose live performances were becoming the subject of their own mythology. But before any of that, before the Moonwalk debuted on national television, before the sequined jacket and the single glove became cultural shorthand for an entire era of music, Michael Jackson had been a child watching a different performer with the specific, total attention of someone absorbing something he didn't yet have language for. That performer was James Brown. Brown, by 1983, had earned titles that few in the music industry could rival. The Godfather of Soul, the hardest-working man in show business, a performer whose stage presence in the 1960s and 1970s had established a vocabulary of movement, energy, and showmanship that an entire generation of artists would draw from, consciously or not, for decades afterward. Michael Jackson had drawn from it directly. The specific physical syntax that would eventually define Michael's solo career, the sharp isolations, the explosive energy contained within precise control, the relationship between a performer's body and the rhythm underneath it, had roots that traced in significant part back to James Brown. Michael had studied him, watched him, absorbed him, in the way that young performers absorb the people who first show them what is possible. This was not a secret. Michael spoke about Brown's influence throughout his career, citing him repeatedly as one of the foundational architects of his own stage presence and his understanding of what a live performance could be. On the night of August 20th, 1983, the student and the teacher occupied the same room. Only one of them knew it yet. The Beverly Theater. The event was billed as James Brown and B.B. King, One Special Night, a showcase at the Beverly Theater in Hollywood that brought together two titans of American music for an evening that, by every account from those who attended, delivered on its considerable promise. The room was packed. The specific energy of a Los Angeles industry crowd, musicians, producers, executives, the particular concentration of people who understood exactly what they were witnessing, filled the theater with anticipation before either headliner had taken the stage. Michael Jackson was seated in the audience, not performing, not scheduled, simply present, the way a fan is present. Though by 1983, Michael Jackson being simply a fan in any audience was already a more complicated proposition than the phrase suggests. His presence in a room changed the room, whether or not he intended it to. James Brown, deep into a set that was, by all accounts, characteristically electric, the band tight, the energy relentless, the specific command of a performer who had spent over 2 decades perfecting exactly this kind of room, was working through a set list that included some of his most enduring material. And then, at some point in the performance, James Brown looked into the crowd, and he saw Michael Jackson. "You've got to come up and say something." What happened next is preserved on video, and it has become, in the decades since, one of the most replayed moments in the archive of soul and pop music history. James Brown stopped what he was doing. He looked toward where Michael was seated, and he began to call his name into the microphone, not once, not as a passing acknowledgement, but repeatedly, insistently, with the specific theatrical persistence that had always been part of Brown's command of a room. "Michael Jackson," he said. Then again, "Michael Jackson." The crowd began to register what was happening, the specific ripple of recognition that moves through an audience when something is unfolding that nobody had been told to expect. Brown continued, "You've got to come up and say something," he called out. "You gotta come up and say something." He said Michael's name 6 times before Michael began moving toward the stage. By the account of those present, and by the footage that exists, Michael appeared hesitant at first, the specific reluctance of someone who had come to watch, not to perform, and who understood that whatever happened in the next several minutes would happen entirely without rehearsal, without preparation, without the careful control that defined nearly every other public appearance of his career by that point in his life. But James Brown was not a man who repeated a request 7 times without expecting it to be honored. Michael made his way through the crowd toward the stage. What happened when he arrived? Michael Jackson climbed onto the stage of the Beverly Theater in what witnesses and later commentators described as remarkably understated clothing for the moment, casual, unplanned, the attire of someone who had dressed to watch a concert, not to deliver one. He approached the microphone. He offered a few words to the crowd, brief, the specific economy of someone acknowledging an unexpected spotlight without overstaying it. Then James Brown's band, locked into the groove they had been holding for the better part of an hour, gave him the space to do something else entirely. Michael began to move. What followed has been described by people who study performance history as a masterclass in instinctive showmanship, Michael working through the specific vocabulary that Brown himself had originated decades earlier, the sharp directional shifts, the rhythmic precision, the command of a stage that had no prepared blocking, no rehearsed transitions, nothing but a live band and an audience that had no idea what they were about to witness. And then, in front of James Brown and in front of a room full of people who would spend the next 4 decades telling others they had been there, Michael Jackson performed the Moonwalk. This was not a small detail. Just 5 months earlier, in March of 1983, Michael had debuted the move during the taping of Motown 25, a performance that would air in May and permanently alter the visual language of popular dance. The Beverly Theater appearance came in the narrow window after that performance had been recorded but had not yet been broadcast to the wider public. The audience at the Beverly Theater that night was among the very first to witness, live, the move that would define a generation's understanding of what Michael Jackson's body could do. They lost their minds. What James Brown saw. James Brown stood on his own stage, watching a 24-year-old performer move through space using a physical language that had, in significant part, originated with Brown himself, and then been taken somewhere Brown had never quite taken it. There is no recorded transcript of what passed through Brown's mind in that moment, but the footage shows a man whose physical reactions, the specific quality of his attention, the way he watched rather than simply performed alongside, suggested something beyond ordinary professional camaraderie. He was watching a lineage complete itself in real time. The relationship between Brown and Jackson had been documented in the years before and after this night as something closer to mentorship than mere mutual admiration. Michael had spoken of Brown's influence on his artistic development for years. People close to both men described conversations between them, Brown offering Jackson perspective on the specific pressures of extended fame, the difficulty of remaining grounded inside an industry built to consume performers whole.
This was not two strangers sharing a stage by accident. This was, by every account available, a continuation of something that had already been growing for years, a teacher watching the specific electrifying evidence of what his teaching had become.
The whisper. After the moonwalk, after the crowd's reaction had crested into something closer to delirium, Michael leaned toward James Brown. He whispered something into his ear. What he said, according to multiple accounts from people involved in the evening, was that Prince, another rising star of the era, was also somewhere in the audience. Brown, by several accounts unfamiliar with Prince's still emerging career at that specific point, took Michael's word for it and began calling Prince's name into the microphone with the same theatrical persistence he had directed at Michael minutes earlier. What followed involving Prince has become its own separate piece of music history, a chaotic, much-discussed sequence that unfolded differently than the moment with Michael had. But that is a different story. The story that belongs to Michael and James Brown ends with the whisper, with one artist having just delivered an unplanned, electrifying display of everything he had learned from the man standing beside him, choosing to extend the spotlight rather than keep it for himself. It is, in its own way, a small but telling detail about who Michael Jackson was in that specific moment of his career. At the absolute height of his fame, in the middle of an unscripted triumph, his instinct was to bring someone else forward. What this night became. The footage from August 20th, 1983 did not initially circulate widely. It existed for years, primarily among collectors and dedicated fans of either artist, the specific underground circulation that preceded the eventual ubiquity of Internet video archives. But as decades passed, and as both men's legacies were studied with increasing historical seriousness, the footage took on a different kind of significance. It became, for music historians, a rare visual document of something that is usually only described in interviews and retrospectives, the literal moment when influence transfers from one generation of a performance tradition to the next, captured not in a controlled studio environment, but in the unpredictable, electric chaos of a live room. James Brown would continue to be cited by Michael throughout the remainder of his career as one of the most significant influences on his artistry. The mentorship between them continued in the years following this night. Michael would later invite Brown to join him during the Victory Tour, extending an established pattern of mutual respect that had been building for years before the Beverly Theater and would continue until Brown's death in 2006. Michael Jackson attended James Brown's funeral. He delivered a tribute that drew on decades of personal history between two men whose relationship had begun with a child studying a record, deepened through years of mentorship and friendship, and had been captured, however briefly and imperfectly, on a single grainy camera in a Hollywood theater in the summer of 1983. The final word. There is a specific kind of historical luck involved in capturing a moment like this on film. So much of what passes between mentors and the people they shape happens privately, in rehearsal rooms, in late-night conversations, in the accumulated influence of one person's example, absorbed slowly over years by someone who is watching closely enough to learn from it. On August 20th, 1983, none of that privacy applied. A man who had spent decades building the vocabulary of American soul performance stood on his own stage and called out 6 times for a 24-year-old he had helped to shape. The student came forward.
And in front of a room that had no idea what it was about to witness, he showed his teacher and the world exactly what that teaching had become. It lasted only a few minutes. It has lasted since then for over 40 years. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the people who shape us are often standing closer than we realize. Leave a comment below. Who taught you something that became part of who you are? We read every single one.